Hi, I'm Rebecca Makkai, author of The Great Believers, and you are watching Author's Voice.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Author's Voice, Authors Connecting to the World. I am Roberta Rubin, and my program is called Berta's Books. And my guest today is Rebecca Makkai, who has written a wonderful new book called The Great Believers. And we will talk, it's published by Viking, $27. And, of course, we always make a pitch somewhere in the early start of the program that if you wanted to order a book and get a signed copy, please go to the website that you're watching right now on either Facebook or live. And you can sign up for a book, and we will send it to you. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome you again.
Thank
you
you
for coming. I picked up this book about a month ago when I knew I would be talking with you. And I thought, what is she talking about? The Great Believers. Why did she use that title? And it's a very appropriate title. Once I read the inscription in the front, which I will read now. We were the great believers. I have never cared for any men as much as for those who felt the first springs when I did, and saw death ahead and were reprieved, and who now walk the long, stormy summer. F. Scott Fitzgerald in the book My Generation. I think I'll start there, though.
Yeah.
Because I want to know why you selected that title.
Right. It's referring, in my mind, to two different things within the book. One is the AIDS generation of the 1980s. That's certainly not who Fitzgerald was writing about in that essay. But most of my book is about the AIDS crisis in Chicago from 1985 to 1992. It's also referring to, more directly, this is what Fitzgerald's essay was about, to the generation we usually call the lost generation, the artists and writers who were in Paris before and after World War I, came there before, especially in the case of the visual artists, to study, to find each other, were decimated by war and by the influenza of 1918, and then came back and were living there in the aftermath, which is when Stein calls them the lost generation. This book is about both of those things. It's also about 2015 Paris, which I think it applies to also. But as I was researching and reading about 1920s Paris in preparing to write this book, not knowing how much of it would be the AIDS crisis, how much would be that time, I found that quote, and I was so fascinated by it. It's a fairly obscure quote, and I'd never seen it before. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested in how it applied equally to both groups, the two groups of people, both of whom came to major cities to find each other, came from all over, had a chosen family in that city, and then war came through, or the AIDS epidemic came through, and decimated a generation, particularly of young men in both cases. So that quote early on tied those things together for me, and it instantly became my title. I knew that I needed to justify that title, and I think it made me write a more optimistic book, actually, than I would have otherwise, because I was constantly asking myself that question of what do these people believe in against all odds? What hopes are they holding on to? And belief isn't always a good thing in this book. There's some naivete in this book as well. But it's not religious belief. My joke is that I called it that to try to trick everyone into thinking it was a Bible study guide and the bright stripy cover that helps. But it's all other kinds of belief. Religion doesn't really enter into it, but belief in every other way.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've answered my next question, which was going to be, why Chicago, and such a vivid portrait of Chicago. I love that. for any Chicagoans who read this book, you will love to track the bars and the streets and where they hung out. Yeah. And then why you interposed it or juxtaposed it with Paris.
Yeah.
And 1985 was the height of the AIDS crisis, I gather, or that's where you put it.
That's where I started the book.
There where you started the book.
Yeah.
And it went to 1990 or 91.
The book, yeah, that part of the storyline ends in 92.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you switch over to 2015 to Paris.
Yeah.
And of course, Paris has some redemption, and Paris has the one of the main characters finding her daughter there.
Right.
And so that was where the daughter lived, and that's why Paris has a much, for me as a reader, a much easier aspect to it than Chicago.
Sure.
But let's talk about Chicago first, because it is, the book to me was about the AIDS crisis. And
yeah, and it's very much about Chicago. I mean, we're sitting here talking in Chicago. It's where both of us live. And I wanted to write a book set here. I hadn't really done that before. My second novel, The 100-Year House, is set near Chicago in the suburbs, but it honestly could have been anywhere. Chicago doesn't really play into it that much. I wanted to write a novel that was very much about Chicago. And in this case, that was reinforced for me by the fact that there are not nearly enough AIDS narratives out there. But what we do have tends to be centered on New York, on San Francisco, maybe LA. And I was curious what had happened here and set out to research, assuming that there would be many books out there that I could find, nonfiction chronicles of the AIDS crisis in America's third largest city. There were no books. There are some larger coffee table books that have sections in there about that. There's some great oral histories that have been curated online. Some wonderful LGBTQ historians here have chronicled certain places, certain events in the city's history. But the book that I was looking for, and I didn't write it because this is fiction, the big nonfiction book of here's what happened with AIDS in Chicago does not exist. So that's alarming. It's still alarming. For me, it was, at least for my writing, a blessing in disguise because it got me out from behind my desk and it got me looking at primary sources, reading back issues of the Windy City Times, for instance, the major gay weekly we have here. And it also got me interviewing people. So I had hours and hours of in-person interviews with doctors, nurses, lawyers, activists, journalists, historians, survivors. And that became not just factual research, but emotional research and textual research.
How old were you in 1985 or during the crisis?
Because
you must not have known.
I turned 7 that year.
You turned 7. I had you at 5, so okay.
Well, thank you.
But so that you really didn't know anyone.
I did not.
That went through the actual height of the crisis.
I do now, certainly.
You do, right.
And some of those friendships pre-exist my writing this book. I've been friends with someone for 10 years. They lived through this, or they're HIV positive, and dating back to that time. But no, as a child, my mother lost one colleague, but it was no one I knew. I just knew about it very vaguely. Mm-hmm. Other than that, here's the thing though, it was the 80s. We were all allowed to watch TV as much as we wanted. Watch 2020, Geraldo, whatever you want, right? And I had, a child's sense of empathy, I think, looking at that. It was very much the backdrop of my childhood, the way that if you grew up during, say, the Vietnam War, and that was what was on the television, it might not have affected your family personally, but you were a child of the Vietnam War. For me, and people right around my age, we are children of the AIDS epidemic. By the time I got to high school, all of our sex ed was HIV and AIDS. It was, very much part of our coming of age, even if that was largely hypothetical. And so it's something I've always been terribly interested in, but until I began researching, really never heard the story of Chicago. I would always be the one to go to see the movie about AIDS or to read the book about AIDS, and just hadn't heard the Chicago story in all of that, which isn't why I set out, I didn't say I'm going to set out to fill this gap. The story evolved very organically. It actually started with Paris in the 20s. The AIDS thing came later. It wasn't the reason I wrote it, but it was the reason that I kept the story in Chicago. You try a lot of things out, and then you abandon a lot of them. And the ones that click, the ones that really feel right, are the ones you keep. And setting the story here really felt right for me.
Mm-hmm. And you wrote it so convincingly, beautiful writing.
Thank you.
So that I felt the input, I felt the involvement of the 1980s reading your book. It kind of reminded me a little, and whether it occurred to you, that during World War II and the Holocaust, we didn't have much literature, much engagement with the Holocaust until the 1980s.
Yes.
When I started selling books in the 80s, they were just opening up doors to get survivors to talk about it. And I wondered if you felt too that there's been an impasse, that there's been very little talk about it. As you say, you couldn't find another book.
Yeah.
And that could have been something like what happened.
I do think that now, in this case, it's been 30 years, similarly, similar span of time.
Similar set of time.
Yeah. I think that there is more happening now. I don't think there's nearly enough. And it's funny, people keep asking me questions like, gosh, there's just a glut of stuff out there right now about AIDS. It seems like, going, really, where? It's not, there's some things. That's great. There have been, some beautiful theater. There's some beautiful memoirs and novels, some wonderful
I've read
nonfiction.
several books about gays and lesbians recently.
Well,
it seems to be a spate of that.
Right. LGBTQ literature is now considered much more saleable to the mainstream, where, originally, 30 years ago, there would have not only would have been their own presses, those would have been their own bookstores. And that we can now sell, Garth Greenwell's book, and that's a bestseller, and your book club is going to pick it up. That things have changed a lot. But in terms of AIDS in specific, there has been a lot of beautiful art and literature out there, and I don't want to sound as if I don't know that, but what I'm saying is it's amazing that there isn't more. The space that this occupies in American history, the things we should be learning about it, and it's not taught in schools, I'm discovering as I go around. I understand, the US history course in the average high school, the end of the year gets very crunched and you maybe get up to Watergate and then that's it, the exam's on Tuesday. But, if we're spending a week on, the Vietnam War in a US history class, why do we study that? We study that to understand America as it was and as it is. We do that to understand cause and effect. We do it so that we don't make the same mistakes again as a country. Those are the exact same reasons we should be studying the AIDS epidemic. We should be devoting as long of a period in our public education to this war, this crisis, as we do to others.
Very well said. Well, I want to get to the characters, the people that are involved in this, particularly in Chicago, and then transferred over to Paris later on. The two main characters, if I'm right, are Yale and Fiona.
Right.
And Fiona and Yale, in the opening chapter, is getting ready to attend the funeral of Nico. And Nico is Fiona's brother.
Right.
So can we start there? Sort of tell me about Yale in Chicago.
Yeah, absolutely. Yale is originally was my only main character. Fiona came into the story later. But Yale is in his early 30s, and he's the development director for a small art gallery at Northwestern University. I have renamed it. It very closely follows the history of the Block Museum, but I've renamed it the Brig Gallery. And so I don't get in trouble, because there's some untoward things that happen there. But it's 1985, which is an interesting moment in AIDS history. It's the year that the HIV test became available, which presents an interesting question to everyone of whether you believe in the test, whether you're going to get tested, whether you trust the results, trust the doctors giving it. And Yale has tested negative, and he really believes that because of that, and because he's in a long-term relationship, that he's going to be safe. But this is the funeral of his first close friend to die of the epidemic. He's known a few other people. And what we see for the next 7 years is the virus circling closer and closer to him, and his life falling apart, but also taking on much greater meaning than it had before. Fiona, she came into the story later for me. There was a point where I realized I wanted to take things into the present day, that I was just as interested in aftermath as I was in the crisis itself. And she'd been a minor character, but she had entertained me when I was writing her. I thought she'd be really interesting to see. We met her when she was 21. I wanted to see her at 51 and see what this had done in her life and the long-lasting trauma, the ripples in the pond from that huge splash of the rock in her life. And she's someone who cared not only for her brother as he was dying, but then for her brother's lover and then many close friends. And it depleted her in many ways, and in many ways she's never dealt with what's very clearly some PTSD. She's been through a war and has not dealt with it.
Well, we see her in a much more glorious setting than Chicago. When
I don't know about that. Let's not.
Oh, when she arrives in Paris, looking for her daughter.
Yeah, yeah.
And Paris, of course, is illuminated in your book. And she finds her daughter, and I'm not going to ruin the story anymore. But I left, when the book ended, I felt satisfied that Fiona had found a happy place to be in her life, that she was not as troubled.
Yeah.
Am I right or
I think
wrong?
you are. And you're not. One of the reasons you're not giving much away is that she finds her daughter pretty early, but finding her isn't enough.
Right.
There's a lot of lost time to make up for, and there's a lot of, her daughter is just genuinely a difficult person. But in addition, Fiona has made a lot of mistakes and is very scarred from her 20s, and has that's affected her ability to care wholeheartedly for someone she's supposed to love fully. She's afraid of what will happen if she loves her daughter completely because of everything that happened to everyone she ever loved when she was younger. So there's a lot more work to be done after she finds her, and so that's one of the reasons you're not giving this away. It's not. Although there's a private investigator in this book, it is not a detective story where that's the end of it.
Detective story.
Right.
Well, of course, looking for a lost daughter immediately grabs everyone's attention. Now, back to Chicago, 1985. I found myself making sure that I tracked all the men that were in this story. And I don't know if others have said to you too, where did you find all these men that you could write about, and who was connected with who? And as you say, how did Yale end up going downhill?
Right.
Because of Julian and Charlie and on and on.
Yeah. I wanted it to be a well-populated novel. I wanted it to be both intimate and broad. And part of that broadness is in the time span, but part of it is also just in the number of characters. And I'm not setting out to represent all experiences of HIV/AIDS in Chicago. This is a group of well-educated, financially okay guys living in Boys Town, living in Lincoln Park. I could have gone in many different directions, many other demographics obviously affected by AIDS. But I wanted all those people to be there, and I wanted this to be a novel about friendship in many ways, about chosen family. And I needed a lot of characters to do that, and to have many different things happen to different people. I did a lot of writing off the page to get to know these characters better. I made a lot of character maps where I kind of put Yale in the center in a bubble and then drew lines going out and other people in other bubbles and who's connected to whom. At a certain point.
That sounds interesting. I would have loved to see that.
Yeah, somewhere.
See the different stories that evolve.
Yeah,
because
somewhere
you feel
it all.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. It's a fun kind of brainstorming. Sometimes it gives you a headache because sometimes certain characters come to me very easily, and others they're hard to get to know. It's hard for me to really dig in and make them come to life, and you have to work a little harder. certain characters you didn't even think they were going to have a major role, and then when they show up, they just steal the scene, and you have someone you can work with. Other people who you might have put in a big role, then you're going, come on, do something. You're a dud. What are you doing here? And you have to really push them and think hard about them to get to know them. Mm-hmm. Charlie is a situation like that for Yale because he's one thing on the surface and something else underneath. And I think it was important that it was hard for me to get to know him because it turns out that Yale doesn't really know him either.
Mm-hmm. And Yale has many faces, many affairs, many different connections. I love to follow Yale.
Yeah,
Yale
good.
was the main character in so many splendorous ways.
Yeah, he really is. It's funny that, because it's in two parts, because it goes back and forth with the chapters, I think people are talking to me as if I intended for Fiona to be as major a character, as if I intended for those chapters to hold equal weight. And you can tell that I didn't by looking at the length of them. Her chapters are maybe a quarter of the length of his until the very end. It's kind of the lighter motif on top, but he's, it's really his story. And I've never, I know certainly it's readers who relate very strongly to her, but I'm never asking you narratively to weigh her story as heavily as his, which is why she gets less time on the page.
And she does, right.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm giving anything away again, but I love your timing of Yale having trouble at the
Crisis,
end. Crisis, and then having a baby born.
Yeah.
Did you plan that?
Oh yes, very much. Yeah. Again, I have to be very careful of spoilers because there's some pretty major spoilers there if we talk about this in the wrong way. But by 1992, a lot of people are dying or have died. 92, just historically, was the highest point of deaths. Not infection rates, but deaths from AIDS. A lot of these infections, dated way back. And then, the medication was staving off some stuff after that. And in 1996, things got much better when much better medicine came out. But so I'm ending things in 1992 when a lot of people have already died and a lot more people are dying. And this is a time when Fiona now is, in her late 20s and is pregnant and is bringing into the world this daughter who we see her estranged from so many years later. And of course, that balance of life and death was something I was thinking about. It was also just interesting to me, the dramatic possibilities of what could happen within the same hospital building. And
I loved it. I have to tell you,
Thank you.
It was one of the highlights of the book for
Thank
me,
you, yeah.
To see how you intertwined
yeah.
life and death.
Yeah.
Death and life.
Right, and the idea of continuation, and this is the fact that people are dying. It does not mean that this is an ending to the story. There's fresh hope. There's also fresh trauma being born constantly, and Fiona has this baby. She's also carrying guilt with her for the rest of her life. She's going to go on now largely alone, and now she has this child. She has this next generation, but she has not dealt with the things she needs to deal with before moving on.
Did I miss something as far as who the father was of Claire?
You might have missed it. It's pretty.
Yes.
Fiona is married to her sociology professor from the University of Wisconsin.
Right.
So
okay.
Yes.
And his name?
His name is Damien.
That's right. Okay. I kept finding Damien, and I kept looking. But Damien didn't go to Paris.
No. It's one of those things. I always do that in a book. If you miss the very first time something's mentioned, and then if you miss it the one time,
yeah. And I said, I have to find that.
Yeah.
So,
no, she's divorced from him. Right. Yeah.
Right. Well, it was a hard time.
Yeah. No, and she's right. Her marriage was another casualty of her, the trauma that she hadn't dealt with.
Do you think the city of Chicago responded in any different way than, let's say, San Francisco or New York? Or
I do, yes.
Tell me how.
So for one thing, we had a little bit more time to prepare here. It really did hit crisis level on the coasts before it hit Chicago. There was a 1 or 2 year time there that we had to prepare. And we, I'm saying we, I was a child, obviously, I wasn't part of this, but we, the city. There was more time to get grassroots organizations up and running. And a big problem eventually in Chicago and immediately in New York and San Francisco is that you'd get a movement going and then the leaders of it were dying. And in Chicago, there was a little bit more time before that happened. Just a little bit, just that much closer to the advent of AZT, which prolonged people's lives. So there's that. We had something really special here with Illinois Masonic Hospital, which had one of the first dedicated AIDS units out there, certainly the first in the Midwest, and was just became a model for compassionate AIDS care around the world. And if people don't know that history, I would encourage them to find out more about it. It's just a treasure that we had here. There's also, Chicago was a major ACT UP site. We know a lot about New York ACT UP. People typically know about Larry Kramer and Peter Staley. Hopefully they know those things. In Chicago, we had, it was a smaller group, a very solid small group that then staged a demonstration that I write about in the book in the spring of 1991, a major national protest against the American Medical Association and a lot of the insurance companies headquartered here that happened kind of all over downtown, that ended up at the county building, where I think there should be a statue, personally. So I think that, first of all, big important things happened here. But in addition, I think the size of the city, the concentration of the gay population in Boys Town, where in New York it would be much more spread out, in San Francisco it would be much more spread out, I think was really conducive to the community caring for itself, to grassroots organizations springing up to deliver food, to advocate for housing, to do all those things. I'd like to, I'm a Chicago snob. I'd like to think that we, have,
So am
right?
I.
I'd love to see some, Midwestern heart in the middle of all of that, that there was, the city of big shoulders and the city, with a big heart, and that we did things. There was certainly a lot that went wrong, and I don't mean to gloss over that, but there were some wonderful reactions and things that we can and should learn from and honor the people who are still with us, who fought here and are still fighting.
Exactly, and I think that what you brought up in the book, those who are still alive and who,
right.
And as you said, you interviewed or worked with them afterwards.
Yeah.
But I agree with you, and as a marketer, as a bookseller, I want this to be a Chicago book.
Yeah.
And it happened in Chicago, and look at how outstanding Chicago was in its responses in many ways. Yeah. And so I too am a Chicago snob.
Well, good.
So I think that was what I came away with too. Paris is glamorous,
right?
No question,
right?
But and life was easier.
Yeah, it's
Paris.
Interesting because in the response to the book that I'm getting, I know that my publishers were excited that Paris is in there. Paris sells books. I've gotten so much more response to Chicago, not just from people who are here now. I'm getting emails from people who say, I lived in Chicago for 3 years way back and I could picture all these intersections. People really love Chicago, as they should.
Right, I agree. Well, as you know, I'm part of the American Writers Museum.
Yes.
And we have a Chicago room, and Chicago has our stable of writers, and you are one of them.
Well, thanks.
And we're very happy that you've written a book about Chicago.
Thank you.
And a tough book, but a good book, and a book with lots of stories. And that is something that I appreciated so much. I enjoyed the book so much because I was starting on a new story or a different story. And as you say, you had pieces out here and there for all the men which stories
Yeah.
were you going to tell them
Yeah,
about them?
yeah. And I feel like it could have gone on and on in so many directions, you know. You have to stop
You
yourself
had to
at
be
a certain
selective.
point. Yeah, and you want to give, in some cases, you do want to tell the whole story, and in some cases, you want to give just a glimmer of it so that it really is the reader's job to imagine the rest of that story. And that's a way of bringing the reader into the work. This story belongs to you too. I've told you a little bit about this character, Teddy. If you want to know more about him, you're going to have to make that up yourself. And that's engagement, though, right? And so that's strategic. Sometimes I'm letting you know a lot. Sometimes someone's really just mentioned, and that character belongs to you now. And it's your responsibility to imagine this person and to think about this person.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now that you're finished with this, is there something following that you, or
Oh, I thought
is
I'd
it
retire.
Too soon?
No.
Is it too soon?
No, I'm thinking. I have kind of 3 simultaneous projects that I'm mulling over and just working on mentally. And I've combined things as well as I can. It can't be combined into one book. They're all 3 equally compelling, and I think I might just start writing all 3 of them. Write 20 pages into all 3 and then see which one I want to continue, because I don't know, this is a hard book to move on from.
Oh, well, yes,
You know?
I can imagine. I
Yeah.
think that's what prompts me to ask you.
Yeah.
Are you thinking beyond this book? Because this book had so much
Yeah.
in it, and with such an important message or an important part of
Yeah.
our life here.
Yeah. Well, it's hard for me because, you know, when you end a book, you're thinking about the broader meanings, and then you're bringing the book out into the world and having conversations about the bigger issues. And when you start a book, you're necessarily starting with, you know, you can start with the big picture, but you're not starting with meaning. That should come later. And I think it's a very bad idea to start a book with the message of the book. You're going to write a really didactic book then. So I'm starting with scenario, I'm starting with plot. And in contrast to all the conversations I'm still having around the great believers, it makes whatever I look at next seem frivolous, which is not helpful, you know.
So you're not ready.
I might not be, or I might just need to remind myself that it's going to seem frivolous and incomplete, and you know, you're never going to start writing and have something on the page that you're instantly excited about. It's always just, you know, it's like if you watch a visual artist work, they're doing a portrait, and eventually it'll be a beautiful portrait, but it starts and it's just this big oval, you know?
Right.
And they have to be okay with that. They can't start in the corner and try to paint a completely perfect photorealist painting centimeter by centimeter starting in the corner. You have to start with rough, sketchy, ugly stuff and gradually fill it in. And I'm telling my students this all the time,
Right.
but I need to keep telling myself that right now, because it's hard. You're looking at, you know, the best work that you've done so far, and it's finished and it's polished and it's been edited by professional editors and it has a cover on it and everything.
That's right.
It's out in the world, and then to go back to the page and be like, it was a dark and stormy night, I don't know.
For all you would-be writers out there, all the writers that are watching this program, take note. Because, and I too, I would like to sit down and write, but I'm listening to you,
Right.
taking note of what it takes to be a
The lesson
writer.
is don't ever finish anything, because then, no, that's not it.
And the lesson is to start something, no matter what.
No, that is actually my point, yes.
Well, thank you very much
Thank
for coming to Author's Voice. And we are reaching the end of our time in this broadcast, talking about the great believers. Please look it up and order a copy and get a signed copy from Rebecca. And thank you for coming, and I say good night.
Thank you.